Okay, welcome to those of you joining. My name's Matt Davis. I am from Clean Water Action, and welcome to our webinar about Cuyama Valley in transition. This is part of the Groundwater Matters series of webinars that we've been running over the last 6 to 12 months, telling the stories of the NGO Groundwater Collaborative. It's been a very well signed up for webinar, this one. Folks seem to be very interested, and we've got some great panelists to have a great discussion. I'll introduce them shortly and then explain our agenda for the next hour. Once again, thanks so much for joining. If you do have any questions while you are in webinar space, there is a space on your webinar box down at the bottom for you to file a question. We've already had somebody say hello on there. Hello, Elise. That's very kind of you to say hello using the questions box, but that is a way of raising your hand to ask questions. There will be plenty of time for audience discussion towards the end of the webinar. We'll start with a panel discussion, but then open things up. So if you've joined us from Europe, I know we have somebody on the phone from Denmark. Thank you very much. If you joined us from nearer afield, also welcome. Let's have a fantastic discussion about groundwater in the Cuyama Valley. Firstly, I'm just going to once again flash this slide up. Before we start, if you haven't watched it already, it's a bit late to do so now, but there is a link there, and it's also been shared in the webinar sign-up form to watch the film. It's a about 10-11-minute film about the valley, and we'll also be sending out the link later. And I know that some journalists are joining us and are interested in kind of following up on the story as well. Your panelists, welcome to our folks joining us. Jennifer Clary with Clean Water Action, my colleague. Are you there, Jennifer?
I am. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Jennifer. We're also joined by Corey Bantalan from Santa Barbara County. Corey, can you say hello?
Yes, I'm here as well. Hello.
Hello, Corey. Where are you right now? Are you in Santa Barbara, or whereabouts are you?
I'm actually in Santa Maria.
Santa Maria. Well, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Lynn Carlisle from the Cuyama Valley Family Resource Center. Are you there?
I am. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Lynn. And Robbie Jeff, a dry farmer in Cuyama. Robbie, are you there with us?
I am here. Hello, everybody, and welcome.
Hello. Hello, Robbie. So the format for this morning, or this afternoon, as it were, I'm going to talk us through the film. I apologize if you have already watched it, but I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes walking us through the film. That doesn't mean I'm going to play the film. It just means I'm going to talk about what was in it. And then we'll have a panel discussion with questions for about 30 minutes. So the four folks that we've just introduced, Jennifer, Lynn, Robbie, and Corey, will kind of discuss some of the questions raised by the film for about 30 minutes. And then there will be an opportunity for about 15 minutes for audience and attendees to ask questions for discussion and to kind of have a lively chat. And then we will wrap up. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll share it on our NGO Groundwater website. So if you'd like to kind of catch this again or re-listen or anything like that, then that opportunity will be available. Once again, if you have any questions, you can do so on the webinar panel. A gentleman or a person named Raven Stevens has said hello from Mount Shasta. So hello to you, Raven. Okay, so let's walk you through the film for 10 minutes. I think it's a brilliant film. Then again, I was involved in its construction. Once again, thanks so much to the folks down there for being part of the film. Really appreciative of everyone's time that was donated to this, and also to Robbie Jeff, who very kindly kind of introduced me to many of the folks that we interviewed. These things really don't come together with that kind of organizing approach, and I really appreciate that. The film opened with a resident of New Cuyama, which I think is a very important attitude to take to this kind of film work, is just to make sure we're hearing from residents about their concerns. Louise Drauka kind of raised the question of the fact that the water picture has changed in the Cuyama Valley. Since she has lived there for 20 odd years, she remembers the kind of water flowing in the river, and it doesn't flow anymore. And just kind of raising the fact that this is one of 21 critically overdrafted groundwater basins across the state. Setting some geographic context, most of the valley is used for farming, and rainfall is low. It averages 7 to 15 inches a year. But Robbie, how much rain so far this year has fallen, do you think?
So far this year, we've, in the area that I'm in, we've only received 2 inches. I think areas east of us have received even less.
Yeah, so it's dry. And there's a kind of shot there illustrating that. There's a sign saying Cuyama River, and there was no water in that river. And also spoke to Matt Young with the Santa Barbara County Water Resources Program. Matt's job is to help groundwater sustainability agencies kind of implement their groundwater sustainability planning. And he kind of pointed out early on that there are some challenges faced by the Cuyama Valley. It's difficult to get water in. There are no tunnels. It's not like you can just bring it in from somewhere else. So really, the valley is dependent on groundwater, and that groundwater is critically overdrafted. So it's a challenge. Next person we spoke to was Derek Urasek, who is the chair of the newly formed Cuyama Valley Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Now, one of our panelists today, Corey Bantalan, is also on that GSA and is featured in the film. There is a picture of it just here on the right. That's some of the members of the GSA, and then we spoke with Jennifer Clary at Clean Water Fund, my colleague, who kind of expressed some concern about the makeup of the committee. Just essentially, many of the folks on the committee don't actually live right there in the valley, and there's a question about how community friendly the makeup of the committee is, which I'm sure we'll come to discussing shortly. Dus Williams, Santa Barbara County Supervisor, who's also on the GSA, kind of talked a little bit about some of the challenges there. And then there is a shot there of some overhead irrigated carrots. It's the real glamour of filmmaking to bring you these kinds of things. What I would say is that it was very striking to me going from the west end of the valley to the east end. In the west end, there's predominantly this kind of dry grazing land, which you can see in the bottom right. And in the top right, there's more of this kind of irrigated land. Although we then introduced Robbie and her husband, Steve, who are dry farmers at the west end of the valley. And Robbie is on the panel, and she'll be talking shortly, but they were just talking about how the land has changed actually at this west end of the valley. They're operating this very kind of, responsible dry farming technique, where the land is not drained down. There's a kind of dry layer on the top of the soil that keeps the water in the ground so it doesn't evaporate, and it's all kind of very responsible and based on old Italian techniques. At the east end of the valley, just around the corner from Robbie and Steve, there's now this new land development that's been going on, and here we have some pictures of it, which are in the film. You can see here's the rangeland just in the foreground, and in the background you can see this sort of very new kind of sweeping change going on, which is this right here, which is the kind of growth of these new conventionally irrigated vineyards. So you can see that each of these vines has a kind of conventional irrigation system attached. It's not the most detailed, but you can see that there's a lot of it, and you can see that it's slightly, it's a new thing. And we'll discuss that again in more detail. We then spoke with Lynn, who's also a panelist today, with Corey, and with Randall, who is a landowner in the valley's west end. Lynn spoke a little bit about some of the kind of curiosity around the Harvard project, saying it's kind of strange that this would be coming in. People don't really know what the Harvard project's about. It's curious. And Lynn also spoke about the importance of involving community members in the decision-making process. Corey, as a member of the GSA, talked about the fact that the GSA is there to make decisions. Particularly kind of made the point that in the past, Corey may have served on some rubber stamp sort of committees, but this committee is actually very powerful. This groundwater sustainability agency is there to create a groundwater sustainability plan by 2020. And as part of that effort, it's going to need to consider overdraft and who can kind of use water. Randall Tognazini is a landowner in the valley's west end, and Randall's a kind of very traditional agricultural voice. He's a chief executive of an agricultural company, and he also expressed concern about the Harvard project. He just said it's going to be difficult to keep enough water on those crops to keep them alive. He was pretty outspoken. I'm not sure if Randall's joined us yet. I'll see if he's a list on. He's not with us now, but he may join us shortly. So that's the film. The questions it raises are around groundwater sustainability, and this is a tricky area. It's about community involvement. It's about how you keep enough water in an area where there isn't enough, and this is all part of the statewide Sustainable Groundwater Management Act process, which Clean Water Action has been instrumental in evolving. So this kind of process is going on statewide, and that's why this webinar is happening all over the state. Critically overdrafted groundwater basins are looking at how to come up with these groundwater sustainability management plans. And that's kind of where we're starting, is how do we involve community voices? How do we make sure that there's enough water, not just for agriculture, but for everyone else? What do we do when there's this kind of outside investment coming in? Big questions. And yeah, let's hope there are some substantial and interesting answers in our panel discussion today. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time. I've got some questions to discuss here. There are plenty of them. Perhaps we could start, I think, Robbie, perhaps you could start us off just saying what makes the valley unique. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you.
Well, thanks, Matt. So I think there's aspects of the Cuyama Valley that are unique, and I also think there are a lot of similarities with other valleys throughout California. But some really important things as we get into this discussion is Cuyama Valley is completely groundwater dependent. Everyone, whether it's someone living in one of the towns in the Cuyama Valley or large agriculture, we're all using the same groundwater. We're all groundwater dependent. There's no surface water there used. The other thing is it's a rather small valley. It's just about 80 miles long. It's also surrounded it's surrounded by national forest and up in the higher elevations and of the basin. So that's an important part of it as well. It's a valley with a low residential population. There are 3 very small towns within the valley, and those towns are all identified in California as what's called disadvantaged communities. So basically, extremely low income with and somewhat of a diverse population. And there's the land for a long time has been ranch land, rangeland, and I'd say in the past maybe 30, 40 years or so, it's been some of the land on the east has been converted to large-scale agriculture.
So there has been this transition. Any of our other panelists want to weigh in on what makes the valley unique?
I can offer, this is Lynn, that it's also, the valley is at some elevation. It's over 2,000 feet above sea level, and that varies throughout the valley. But for that reason, much of the valley is grown, what's grown in the valley is grown organically. So the property is quite valuable because of it. And it takes 3 years for land to become considered organic. And so it's a process that growers have to invest quite a bit in to become organic and preserve that status.
So the crops that are being grown are quite valuable, and it does feel like a small valley comparatively Having been in other valleys in California, it feels like a small valley. It feels kind of the sides are kind of closed in, and it's a kind of unique geography and very beautiful as well. Just to drive through and to kind of be there, it's a unique place.
This is Lynn again. It's also quite isolated. So it's about 52 miles from Santa Maria and 42 miles to Taft, which are sort of larger city areas. But we don't have. It's quite distant from grocery stores, any other resources. There's only 2 schools there. We have 235 students in those schools. So we have very, very few resources in the valley itself.
Yeah, and actually getting down there is not easy. And in terms of sort of press coverage, there's no journalists really kind of actively covering Cuyama Valley, right? I mean, it's not a kind of active press presence or anything like that.
No.
No, there's no local newspaper. There's no local media really, and actually most people do not have internet connections.
Yeah. And in fact, I know from first-hand experience, Robbie, that it's impossible to get on the internet at your house without daisy chaining onto somebody else's better connection. So it's a challenge. It's remote. It feels remote, and 50 miles from Santa Maria it's a long way into that valley. So yeah. So how has the Cuyama Valley changed over the last 20 years? That's a kind of question that Louise brought up. She said obviously it's got drier. I'd be kind of interested to hear your perspectives on that.
Well, this is Robbie. I guess I'll start in, but I mentioned it before. I think there's been a transition over the last 20 years in several ways, and most of it is with large agribusiness coming in, mainly companies that are based in the San Joaquin Valley, have started growing crops on the eastern end of the valley, and thus increased the pumping and the use of groundwater. And that's had mainly been based on the east end, and then in the past 5 years, for the first time, a large scale, the vineyards that Matt showed in the slides and you saw in the film were planted actually after the California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, after SGMA passed. And there's been about 850 acres of grapes planted, vineyard planted, and it's actually an investment by Harvard University's endowment fund.
So that is true. And Jennifer, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about SGMA. For those who are joining us who aren't fully familiar, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is an act that you were involved in crafting, and it means that California has to create plans for groundwater sustainability. Is that right?
That's correct. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed by the legislature in the heart of the drought in 2014, and it requires high and medium priority basins. So not every basin in the state, but every basin on which humans are heavily dependent has to have a sustainable groundwater management plan. Now, what the act did is it split those basins into critically overdrafted basins and everyone else. And the critically overdrafted basins, like Cuyama, have to have their plan done sooner. They have to have their plan done by January 2020. And that plan is supposed to be a 20-year roadmap for how you operate sustainably, so how you stop that overdraft. And I think when folks are talking about how difficult it is for Cuyama, they're thinking about sort of the state plumbing. So, the Central Valley, which is critically overdrafted, has a canal that hooks up to the Delta, and they get millions of acre feet of water a year. It's not enough to counteract their overdraft, but that's an outside water source that they can partially rely on. And Cuyama can only rely on the water that actually falls at their high elevation valley. So makes it pretty fragile.
So I guess there's a question then. So there needs to be a plan. Robbie mentioned that the Harvard project is planted after the passage of Sigma, and I guess that there are two questions. One would be, how do the Harvard vineyards impact efforts to reach groundwater sustainability? And two, is there anything in the law that says by planting before a plan is written, you get around the possibility of any kind of changes having to be made as a result?
Well, generally speaking, when you drill for groundwater on your property, you essentially have the right. You have the right, an appropriative right to that groundwater. What Sigma said was that you don't get that right between January 1st, 2015, and the date that your groundwater plan is adopted. So during those 5 years, that appropriative right doesn't exist, and when the plan is adopted, the GSA can choose whether or not those wells that were dug in that interim period are going to be incorporated into the plan, or how they're going to be incorporated into the plan. I don't know how Cuyama or any other GSA is going to appropriate those rights, but that they do have a distinction from existing wells.
Okay. Lynn, you were kind of outspoken in the film. You said the Harvard project's a bit of a mystery to many local residents. Would you like to expand on that?
I think that that's rapidly changing. When we did the film, because the GSA has been formed, and also a new agricultural water district was formed this year, which was not in existence before. And the agricultural water district was formed with the explicit intention of seeking representation on the GSA. One thing about the valley we didn't mention is it also overlies 4 counties. We have 4 separate counties represented with different water agencies, different constituencies and stakeholders. So it's not an easy governance situation in terms of the GSA. So relative to Harvard, they were not included in the formation of the new agricultural water districts. So they are considered what would be called in the white areas. So they are also not actually financially participating in the development of the GSP. And they won't actually probably have financial participation until the GSP goes into effect. And then there'll be, 218 assessments, and they will be financially participating, but which means that they basically have as much voice as any other resident or de minimis user in the valley. But they also are having a pretty large perceived impact on the aquifer. There is also, in the West End, as Robbie can talk about where they are, there's much debate about its impact, its impact on the overall aquifer in the valley. And the United States Geological Survey did a study that ended in 2011 that made some observations. There's been subsequent studies, and that will be, I'm sure, a large part of the debate coming into the formation of the GSP. But just to update you, we do have, there are now representatives of the Harvard planting that are coming forward and trying to communicate with the community about what they're doing. So I'm sure that more details and information will come forward.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that we heard one of the attendees on this webinar today had heard that Harvard had invested in vineyards in another part of California and had raised similar questions from community members about the kind of viability from a groundwater sustainability perspective. So their investment in Cuyama Valley it sounds like one of several wine investments around the state. And it will be interesting. I know that as we get into the Q&A, it might be interesting to hear from that person what they found in the other part of the valley. I do want to kind of move through this panel discussion and move on to the next questions, but we will come back around, I think, to Harvard. I guess my next question would be, how important is groundwater for the residents of Cuyama Valley? I know we have kind of covered this a bit, but Corey, I figure you're on the GSA. Do you want to kind of talk about this a bit? Like, how important is the groundwater situation?
Well, Robbie touched on it a little bit. Groundwater is the only source of water, and you know, the community members who live there, a lot of them, their jobs depend on agriculture. Without agriculture, they don't have a job. Without water, there's no agriculture. And so it's interesting because there is somewhat of a rift between agriculture and the community. But at the same time, they really all ought to be working to preserve groundwater because everybody depends on it. Everybody's livelihood does. So it is very, very important. You know, without groundwater, there really is no appreciable population possible in the valley.
How is it in terms of being on this committee? I mean, you mentioned in the film you've been on some rubber stamp committees in the past. This certainly doesn't feel like that. Do you feel that the committee is really grappling with some pretty tricky issues?
Certainly we are. You know, I mean, this is people's livelihoods and their lives. You know, and so this is very important stuff. People are very passionate on the committee, and you know, I think for good reason. You know, I mean, the community is passionate, the growers are passionate, and I think you even see the governmental representatives be passionate. So I think we all recognize how important it is.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me to come down and film there. I've been involved as a journalist before this job at Clean Water Action in covering kind of committees and government processes as they played out. And one could tell that the room that Groundwater Sustainability Agency was happening in was kind of fraught with potential conflict, but also potential opportunity. It was a situation where everybody is invested and brings something to the discussion, and everybody wanted something from it. So there was a really kind of strong effort to facilitate a constructive discussion, and you could tell that this was this kind of very weighty thing being discussed. I am curious. The next question for us to discuss is kind of what community think of the GSA process to date. I suppose, Lynn, you'd be best placed to answer this. Although, Robbie, I know you're also on the kind of a community advisory committee, right? So what do the community members think of the process? And Lynn, perhaps you could also talk about the folks you've tried to bring into the process recently.
So I think that it's just been a long process. We learned about this as it was being discussed in Sacramento in 2014. It passed at the end of that year. So we've had quite a long time to educate ourselves about SGMA and what the implications would be. And then we went through the process of participating in observing the LAFCO process to approve the Cuyama Agricultural Water District. So we have probably at our agency has helped to put on, I would say, about a dozen town hall meetings, and that has drawn, you know, different constituencies from the valley. And then subsequently, it's the formation of the GSA, which was a very complicated process because there are 4 counties involved in different agencies. We also have a community residential water district. It's called the Cuyama Community Service District, and they basically deliver water through 2 wells when they're both working to residential water users in New Cuyama, which is a town site, not an unincorporated town site in the valley. So there are various stakeholders, and the process of putting the GSA together was fraught, but it was done, you know, over many months. And there's now a joint powers agreement that governs how the GSA does what it does. And then the GSA also, at the request of many people, including the GSA members, formed an advisory committee. And the advisory committee is also part of that joint powers agreement. And it is to participate in all implementation of SGMA in the Cuyama Valley. The one issue that we do have is that the representation on the GSA and the advisory committee isn't necessarily representative of the demographics of the valley. On the GSA, only 1 of 11 members is a resident, and it's only part-time. None of them, as Robbie mentioned, this is a disadvantaged community. It's actually the whole valley is considered disadvantaged, and we are, the GSA is seeking grant funding from the Department of Water Resources through Prop 1 monies that will come to the valley. They've asked for over $2 million in grant money that will come to the valley based on its disadvantaged status, will not have to match those monies. So most of these grants will have a matching 1-to-1 grant funding requirement, and these grants will not, because this is a disadvantaged community. However, on the GSA, and on the advisory committee, there are no disadvantaged community members, nor are there any Latino members, which in the Cuyama Valley, often there is a direct correlation between ethnicity and income. So the representation is less than ideal, and we are doing work on that. But I've spoken too much already, so I'll stop talking.
Something that I heard when I was in the room there was one of the GSA members said, you know, we've asked folks to come from, we've asked Latino folks to come and talk at this meeting, and they don't show up. And I'm just kind of curious, Lynn, if you had any response to that statement. Really, it's like the process is open; folks can come if they want. Is there a kind of reason why, particularly Latino members of the community might not want to come and voice their concerns in a forum like this?
I think historically in the Cuyama Valley, there's been sort of a segregation between the Latino and Anglo members of the community in terms of their participation in many different projects. And a lot of it has to do with education, it has to do with resources, it has to do with timing. I think that the GSA member was quite correct, that does happen, but I think what is necessary is a greater and better and more thorough outreach effort to our Latino community. And I believe that those issues will be addressed by the development of the GSP. There are outreach activities that will be incorporated in it. We've just seen some, very brief outlines of what those outreach activities will be. So I do appreciate that process going forward. From the perspective of our agency, we've actually, recognizing this as a problem, we have actually reached out to the Latino community much more directly and have empowered a group of people who are getting very deeply involved. So we're doing some very direct hands-on small group workshops in Spanish with materials provided by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they're incredibly committed and are understanding this process and what it's going to mean for not only for themselves, but also for their children. I mean, this plan goes fully, and it's going to go far into the future. So their children and their children's children will be affected. So it's getting everybody up to speed now, and also, as SIGMO indicates, one of the stakeholder groups that must be taken into account is the disadvantaged community. So how we can educate and then elicit their input to this process and their concerns and issues that would be incorporated directly into the GSP is going to be vital going forward.
Yeah. So I think we've touched on this, asking what more could the GSA and its members do to respond to community issues and concerns. So you kind of set out there a fairly aggressive plan to more constructively involve Latino members of the community. Is there anything more that the GSA and its members could be doing?
Can I jump in here? This is Corey.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
I think outreach is probably our first major test as a board, and it's very tricky in the Valley because of a lot of the things that have been mentioned by others. But I really think that we need to do just a very, very good job, leave no stone unturned. And at the end of the day, if somebody does not participate, we want that to be on them, right? We want to contact everybody and give them the opportunity and make it easy for them. And so I'm very eager to see the plan set forth by our consultants and comment on that and helped mold that into something that works for everyone.
Anyone else?
This is Robbie. Yeah, this is Robbie. Can I add something to that as well?
Of course, of course.
Lynn mentioned that as part of the Joint Powers Agreement forming the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, advisory committee was set up, and I chose to be. I'm on that advisory committee. There are 7 of us currently. Of those 7, 5 are actually part-time or full-time residents in the Valley. And my hope is that, and I think we're going to see how this evolves, but my hope is that The advisory committee will be a very serious voice representing the community and the residents, and really helping play a critical role in shaping the sustainability plan so that it truly is a plan that envisions a future for the Cuyama Valley, and that future, as Corey mentioned earlier, has to include groundwater.
Yeah. So
just as one other note, I think that I think there is much emphasis placed on creating a groundwater sustainability plan that is technical, hydrogeologically based, which is certainly true, but the plan itself also has to take into account other factors. And I think that the community is best served and the best voice to help determine what those factors are. For example, if there's less planting, maybe it's scaling back by 20%. I mean, I don't know if we mentioned this, but Cuyama Valley is actually, the USGS study just determined that there was twice the rate of drafting versus recharge. So it's being overdrafted at twice the rate of recharge. So technically, we would have to cut back on 50% of planting because that's the greatest use of water there. That's probably not going to happen, but any scaling back of growing or planting is going to affect jobs. It's going to affect the school. It'll probably affect dust issues if there's not cover cropping. So there are a number of factors that are very, very in place locally based that are also on part, should also be part of that plan.
Jennifer, perhaps you could speak to this issue. When you were involved in the crafting of Sigma, did you envision these processes playing out locally with hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent on consultants and all these kind of complexities playing out and tensions? And what did you think? What do you think of the processes as it's playing out now?
Well, I think trying to make groundwater sustainable is complex, and essentially by adopting Sigma, we took away that kind of fake veil between surface water and groundwater, where surface water is pretty strictly regulated and groundwater is not, so that you could pretend like you were operating sustainably by pumping groundwater and not actually accounting for what was going on. So we knew it was going to be difficult, especially in areas that were heavily dependent on groundwater, like the Cuyama Valley. And the real question is how the GSA, the difficult part of the GSA hasn't even begun yet. The two difficult pieces are assessing money to implement your plan and implementing potential restrictions on pumping, and also measuring pumping, because in most cases groundwater pumping isn't metered. So I think we all knew there were going to be very difficult decisions, and the decision was made that those decisions were best made at the local level. But I think what we're going to see are several hundred arguments like the one, or debates like the one that's going on in Cuyama.
So just to kind of follow up on that, Lynn mentioned there, there's a potential, right now the overdrafting is happening at the rate of 2 to 1, apparently. So what she said there is basically the milkshake is being drunk at twice the rate it is able to be replenished. Now, if I'm Harvard and I'm my $36 billion investment committee looking at my spreadsheet and I'm thinking, I need to see a return on my vineyards, what do I think when I hear something like 20% reduction in planting?
Well, I don't think it's a 20% reduction in planting. I don't think you tell a farmer how much he can plant. You tell him how much water he can use, or how much his pumping has to be reduced. And then based on that, he makes a decision about what he plants. And I think what you might be looking at in Cuyama are changes in irrigation types, potentially changes in cropping patterns to accommodate demand restrictions. But I don't think you can tell people, legally you can't tell people what to do with their land. You can just say, this is how much water you get to use on your land.
Again, not to belabor the point, but let's say I am a member of Harvard's Natural Resources Investment Committee and somebody's telling me that the amount of water I'm using to irrigate my new 850 acres is 6 times what I'm allowed by law, and that there's not much I can do about it. What do I think in terms of the likely financial return?
Well, I think there's two things. One, I think investment agriculture is based on risk. And in this case, I think that they might have invested inappropriately. They might have assessed risk inappropriately. I think another question is when you have a high value crop and a deep pocket investor, it could be that one thing that happens is that Harvard purchases water from other groundwater users in the valley to try to make up for some of that shortfall. So having internal valley market could perhaps be one of the outcomes if the plan is sufficiently rigorous.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have kind of a couple more questions, and then we're going to open this up for a Q&A. So, folks, if you do have questions and you've been listening eagerly to the content here, there's a way to raise your hand in the webinar software. You can just raise your hand. I think the button says "Raise My Hand." It's very intuitive. Or you can type a question in the questions box. So, for example, a comment that somebody made, Jane Subi made the comment that she said it'd be really good to have some examples of GSAs that do have locals participating in the film. And certainly we are endeavoring to give some coverage to good community outreach efforts as well. So that's something we'll be following up on. And obviously this is potentially a good community outreach effort itself. But if you do have a question, do please go ahead and ask it in the questions box, and I will look for those shortly. But for now, I just have two more questions for our panel, which is, okay, what needs to happen next? And more importantly, what causes are there for optimism? Because I think it's probably good for us to feel good before we go into our Q&A. So what causes are there for optimism?
This is Robbie. I think we're seeing an effort being made to bring in all of the community, having full representation, and I think we're seeing the start of an outreach plan that I think the community will have a lot of input into. So I think that's all really positive. I would like to see, one of the things is my hope is, and something that I'm optimistic about, is that I hope we'll be talking more than just about cutting back in water or limiting the way things already are, but that we envision what the future can be, so that we stop and we use this as an opportunity to say, okay, what would it look like to really have sustainable farming systems in the Cuyama Valley? What are the resources that the valley, what's the water limits that the valley have? How do we work with that? And how do we really create a viable, sustainable community? And I hope that's some of the discussion that we'll get to with the GSA.
Okay. Causes for optimism. Corey, cheer us up.
Well, we certainly have a lively committee. I mean, I think that there are several of us, you know, and I'd like to include myself in this bunch, that are really, you know, actively trying to, you know, bridge the gap and communicate, you know, with different, I don't want to call them factions, but there, you know, there are some factions on the board, you know, and really just try to find some middle ground. And I see a lot of optimism for that. I think there's a larger group of us than I initially thought, actually. So I think that's a good thing.
And I would just say, I think it's really exciting that, and one of the advantages is that Cuyama Valley is isolated, and they can't look to anyone else to save them. They can't say, oh, we'll pump more water from the Delta to balance this. They know that they have to create their own solution, and I think that is really going to help them come to reality in a timely fashion.
So I feel quite optimistic. Go on.
I just wanted to offer something in terms of what can happen now. I think that I feel very optimistic that I think that so many issues are being presented and being dealt with. Everything is really being, you know, respectfully managed, I believe, in this process. But I think what could happen now, we sort of feel a little bit like we're operating in a bubble. We say, well, what are other communities doing? Cuyama is not the only one that's doing this. We just happen to be one in the top 10 overdraft in the state. So we're one of the canaries in the coal mine here, but we also could, all of us, I think all the GSAs forming GSPs around the state could work together to create a network of sharing information. How are you guys defining sustainability? What is your outreach plan? What are you hearing from state agencies about, certain portions and disadvantaged community issues and all these things? I think that I can't envision that all of the GSPs will come together alone. And so my question to most of the participants is, how are other people solving this particular question or debating this question? I think there's a great building resource here, and I think finding a way to connect us all would be a wonderful thing to happen next.
Yeah, agreed. And go on, Corey.
Sorry, just one last thing. So we have a lot of carrots under Sigma, or a lot of reasons, to work together. There's also a stick. If we don't figure this out, the state will. And I don't think that anybody wants that at this point. And so, I do think that is a reason for optimism. We really have to figure something out. And the way that we're structured under the JPA, there's got to be a supermajority. So we really do have to find consensus.
Real quick, just a supermajority means 2/3 vote, right? For anything, like you have to pass the groundwater sustainability plan by 2/3 vote.
It's actually a 3/4 vote.
3/4.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. And there are indeed a lot of carrots in the valley, as we earlier reviewed. But agreed. I mean, this idea that the state will come in and fix it if it's not good means that folks have this kind of opportunity. And to address what you said, Lynn, about kind of forming a network, the goal of these webinars is to connect folks from groundwater sustainability agencies around the state and from NGOs and community partners working on these things to start this kind of conversation. It isn't easy to facilitate conversations about groundwater sustainability plans between community members from various areas of California, and we're doing our best. But I do think, any suggestions folks have for how we can kind of capture this information and share it, absolutely interested in hearing your views. So just moving us on then, just to Q&A part of this session, what questions do you have? If you're in the audience, please do go ahead and ask a question in our question box. I do have a couple. Ashley Boren asks, and I think this is going to go, Jennifer, to your point about really the valley being on its own and needing to solve this problem from a groundwater perspective. Does Cuyama Valley experience floods or high water events? And is there an opportunity to capture that water and recharge it into the aquifer while maintaining what's needed for the environment? My sense is that no, it doesn't ever, right? And there's never a high water event in the valley.
I think that might be Robbie's question to answer.
Yeah.
So there can be high water events. There can be some flooding in the lower part of the basin, and we sometimes do get flash storms with flooding. And I don't think, as far as I know, there's been any effort to put any kind of basins to capture that. One of the issues, though, that does happen is that when those events happen, we usually get more mud flowing than water flowing. So that would be an issue with it, I would think.
Yeah, but certainly something that could be part of a solution as considered. I mean, it's something that is happening, and that's actually news to me. I didn't know.
I think what I would say is that the opportunities for recharge are much less in Cuyama Valley than they are in the San Joaquin Valley, A, because there's less water flowing through the valley, and B, because there really isn't a significant amount of outflow. I think we'll find out more about that when we see what the water budget is for the valley. But right now, I believe the Cuyama River runs dry most of the year, so it would just be that short. Is there a significant enough rainy season to capture water? And I think I'm sure there's opportunity to capture more, although there's very little flood infrastructure or impervious pavement in Cuyama Valley. So I think that what you're looking at for Cuyama would be an order of magnitude less than you'd be looking at in the San Joaquin Valley.
Right. Thanks, Ashley Boren, for the question there. Sorry, Robbie, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
And I would just say, like, the times when we will have any kind of flooding will be in an El Nino year or something like that. So it is very occasional. It's not regular.
Okay, next question from Natalie Hobson. Natalie mentions that in 2013, Paso Robles passed a moratorium on new vineyard projects because of dramatic groundwater reductions. So those reductions really were noticed and affected community members. Natalie asks, has a sort of moratorium or restriction on pumping been considered by the GSA? Has there been any talk of possible incentives before the GSP is finished for heavy water users to lower their pumping? Or is this kind of off the table until the plan is written?
I can answer that, I think. This is Lynn. In 2013, there was a request to the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors to have a new well drilling moratorium put in place. However, that was not passed, and the county council essentially advised that it would have to be county-wide, so they couldn't, and at that time the GSA, the GSA had not been formed. There may be discussion to have limitations in those basins that are under SGMA, but that has not been put forward. And again, reminding the audience that Cuyama there are 4 counties that overlay Cuyama. So having pumping, although much of the pumping happens in Santa Barbara County, pumping restrictions in this basin would probably have to go to all 4 counties for approval. But no, there's nothing in place right now.
Yeah. Again, I think just you mentioning this idea that there are 4 counties involved in the jurisdiction over this just does make every single decision 4 times more complex, and probably exponentially more than that even. It's like getting anything decided is a challenge.
If I can kind of add something to that, there are very few groundwater ordinances, significant pumping restrictions in county ordinances around the state. I think Stanislaus County might have the most significant one, and they don't necessarily, they restrict pumping within a certain distance of surface water. So I think a big question mark in SGMA implementation is that counties still retain all of their authority to approve groundwater drilling. And so this GSA has to come to some decision about what appropriate drilling is in terms of irrigation wells.
Thanks for the question, Natalie Hobson. Next question is from Jane Slummer. Just basically saying, will the groundwater sustainability plan include a drawdown limits? In other words, going out the door even before the state's first 5-year goalpost, will the plan really shoot for a recovery that can be perceived by locals and recognized in the environment? Corey, do you want to answer that? Going to be a drawdown limit? A bit early,
I don't know,
isn't it?
I don't know that we can predict anything at this point, right? I mean, very difficult. Like I said, you got to get 75%. We need something. And you mentioned the community. You know, the state's not going to sign off on this without the community feeling like they got a fair shake, and that we did a pretty darn good job. And so, it's really tough to speculate on really any specifics. But I think, I think the community really is going to get their say at the end of the day.
So when is the plan aimed for? I know the consultant was setting out a timeline when they were kind of saying what they would deliver. When are you expecting to have a first plan to kind of look at and review?
Wow, honestly, I don't have that off the top of my head. Robbie, you might.
Yeah, I remember it being like mid 2019. I think. Robbie, is that right?
It's true. What's interesting is there've been for a small valley, we've had a lot of studies, and all of the studies say there are not enough studies. So there's clearly more information that needs to be collected before we can really put a model together and begin coming up with a plan. So what's been fascinating to me, which is I'm sure is how all the, I assume all the GSAs around the state are having similar processes, but where, our GSA is contracted with mainly with one consultant organization consultant to develop the plan, and they have the task of coordinating everything from developing the hydrological model to doing the community outreach. So things are going to start moving really quickly. They really need to meet the 2020 deadline. I used to think the 2020 deadline was too far away, and now I'm seeing the work that has to go into it. So I think we'll have some important benchmarks coming up.
And we are talking about, I was just going to say,
go ahead.
Roughly a year of discussion. So I mean, early 2019 is a goal. Hopefully we get there, because I do think there's gonna need to be some time to work this out. So that is a good ballpark that you mentioned.
And I just want to put in a dose of realism, and that is overdrafting is not going to stop in January of 2020. The GSAs are given 20 years to bring themselves into sustainability. What they have to do is draw up a plan. And it could be that they'll institute a variety of practices over time, and if a certain number of practices reach their goal, then they won't have to do demand management. Maybe they can do something else, to like markets or something, to reach their number. So just saying that overdraft doesn't end when the GSP goes into effect.
Thanks, Jennifer. If there's any more folks attending who have questions, this is the time to ask it. We have about 2 minutes left before we'll be wrapping up. Honestly, this is your last chance. If you have a question, please go ahead and ask it in the panel. Here's one more. Last question then, unless there is one more from anyone else, this will be the last question. Natalie Hobson again asking, how improbable is the possibility of implementing the state water project into Cuyama Valley? And the state water project, does that mean the tunnels, I think? Is that what folks mean?
That's the California aqueduct. The tunnels are what they want to do to expand the project, but there's an existing project that exports several million acre feet. And I would say it's virtually impossible that the Central Valley project would be expanded to Cuyama. I mean, for one thing, I don't see the farmers in Cuyama Valley paying to A, for the cost of the water, and B, for pumping it up 2,000 feet.
So she's saying any outside water, she meant. So basically no is the answer. There's no chance of any outside water.
The Central Coast is one of the most water restricted areas of the state. They continued pretty much in drought after the rest of the state received torrential rains last year, because their groundwater basins hadn't responded, and they're more susceptible to drought than other parts. So it's and they're also, the Central Coast in general is more reliant on groundwater than the rest of the state.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining today, and I'm going to give everyone a chance to give 30-second wrap up in a moment, but I want to respect everyone's time. And so we will only be finishing 2.5 minutes over 2 o'clock, which is spectacular for an NGO's timing, I think. And everyone is to be congratulated. Thanks to everyone for participating. If there are questions, my colleague Jennifer Clary is on jclary@cleanwater.org, and I am on mattdavis@cleanwater.org. Happy to put folks in touch with panelists, questions, and so on that can be relayed. Wanted again to thank everyone. So perhaps Jennifer, you can round us up, and then we'll go to Lynn, Robbie, and Corey, and then I'll finally sign us off. Jennifer, any last thoughts?
I just want to say that places like Cuyama Valley are really paving the way for GSA formation and GSP formation around the state, because they're critically overdrafted and they have to finish 2 years before anyone else. So I know you want to see what other people are doing, but I think other people are going to be looking at Cuyama for some help.
Lynn?
I appreciate the depth of this process, and I think that I'm hopeful that all stakeholders will be respectful of one another's positions and really make a good faith effort to bring everybody's perspectives and needs and issues to the fore. I can see a lot of transformation and empowerment can take place in this valley that has not happened before. So hopefully we'll all stay on a positive footing and come up with a plan that benefits everybody.
Great. Robbie.
Thank you. I think this is a phenomenal opportunity, and my hope is that Sigma will be implemented in the Cuyama and around the state with its full intent to really create a sustainable groundwater plan. And my hope in the Cuyama is that it will lead to us really looking long-term at our valley and our resources and how they can best be managed.
Thanks, Robbie. And Corey, do you want to sign us off with something?
Just want to say thank you, Matt, for really shedding more light on this. Like you said, there isn't a whole lot of press coverage on this. Cuyama is a pretty isolated community, but we all feel this is a very important issue. And I look forward to working with the rest of the panelists moving forward. It's going to be a very interesting next couple of years for me and I think all of us.
Yeah, great. Appreciate it, and thanks everyone again for joining and for joining on the phone. I've just highlighted on the slide there the website cagroundwater.org. It's one for you to bookmark. This webinar will be recorded and put on there along with the film, which will no longer have a password shortly. I know that there are a couple of journalists on the line now, and that there are other journalists also interested in this issue. So hopefully there will be some more press coverage, and certainly will serve as a hub for connecting people with interested parties. So hopefully, again, this can be a kind of microcosm for the way that the groundwater process could evolve throughout the state. And once again, just wanted to thank everyone very much for their time and investment in this process so far. Really appreciated. So thanks. And with that, we will conclude our webinar. There'll be another one in 6 weeks or so. Look forward to speaking with everybody then, and do feel free to join. This has been your webinar. Thanks very much.